Imagine it's 1922. 10 million young men have died. Europe is in ruins from the Great War, and worse, you've been forced to go to work every day at a bank. It's a situation ripe for discontent, and T.S. Eliot, an erudite American expatriate, channeled it into a towering monument of modernism, the 433-line poem The Wasteland. With the help of mustachioed proto-Nazi Ezra Pound, Eliot gave the world an allegorical tour de force. Alluding to everything from Dante and Ovid to modern pub conversations in ragtime, this poem is the 20th century on paper. Eliot fractured the modern world into cultural shards and gave us the view from its glittering, broken angles. We've encountered this Picasso of the pen in our educational wanderings, but never gotten down and dirty with the poem itself. So, we poured ourselves some of Eliot's favorite gin martini cocktails and headed to the endnotes. It's time for episode 93 of Toasting the Classics, The Wasteland. Welcome to Toasting the Classics, the podcast where we take something that people call a classic and we drink something inspired by the classic while we talk about it. My name is Dave McArthur.
My name is Dr. Clinton Lanier, PhD, professor at your service.
Wow, you really make me feel drabby by comparison with your...
I just repeat the same thing that I do.
What are we doing this week?
So we are doing my pick. We had to do a reading, or I had to do a book rather. So this is a very short book, but it's a complicated book. We could talk a whole semester class about this, and there are semester classes about this. This is T.S. Eliot's famous 1922, I believe, long-form poem called The Wasteland.
I got a whole book. I was at a really nice bookshop, actually, when you sent me the message that this is what you wanted to do. So I got the annotated Wasteland, like a good 225-page book,
Okay,
pretty much all about it. I got about halfway through. I read I read a bunch of the annotations, and then I haven't read the prose that T.S. Eliot wrote that touches on the poem, which is the second half.
Okay. Well,
I think I'm probably going to be okay without that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's okay. Well, especially because it changed over time, like what he said about it and how he felt about it.
He said all kinds of stuff about this poem, definitely, or about his writing in general. So
yeah, there's a postmodern or a post-structuralist philosopher theorist. I can't remember if it was Roland Barthes or if it was Foucault, who wrote a piece called "Death of the Author."
That sounds more like it would be.
Okay, that was Barthes. Yeah, that was Roland Barthes. So Roland Barthes talked about death of the author, and basically it was that before post-structuralism, like you sort of took the author at their word. Somebody would write whatever it happens to be, The Wasteland, for example, and then T.S. Eliot would say, well, this is what I meant by that, or this is what this was, or this is what that means. And that's what it meant, right? And so literary criticism was all about trying to figure out what the author's intention was and what the author meant by that. With post-structuralism, and then more so with postmodernism, you basically have this approach where you just forget about the author. Who cares about the author? It doesn't matter what the author said. Doesn't matter what the author meant. Doesn't matter what the author intended. It's all about the audience. It's all about you and your experience and you reading it. What does it mean to you? Blah, blah, blah. And I think that was sort of prompted by, like, if you look at T.S. Eliot, what he said about the Wasteland in the 1920s is different than what he said about the Wasteland in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, he said, I never intended for it to be about despair and agony and depression and some statement on modern society. And it was actually supposed to be optimistic and upbeat. But back in the 20s and 30s, he agreed with everybody that said that, I think this is really about despair. He's like, yeah, that's what it's about.
I think that there's no question that this poem is about the state of society in 1922 and how bad things were and how bad people felt. But I think there is a reasonable interpretation where there's an optimistic undercurrent to this poem as well. I think you could make that argument, but probably that has to do with the changes in T.S. Eliot's life as he got older. If he said something completely different and optimistic, I think he was not the same person.
Maybe so. And I guess we have to back up a little bit.
We do. First of all, let's get our drink.
Let's get our drink on. Okay. We used to wait until the middle. Remember when we were young and naive, and we'd wait until the middle of this thing before?
I think that's crazy. I think that then people lose the benefit of hearing what we sound like as we get slightly sloshed towards the end of the podcast.
So what are we drinking? Oh, yeah, it was my thing. So we are drinking. So T.S. Eliot once said, there is nothing quite so stimulating as a dry martini cocktail. It's just a great quote. That's why you have to be an author, so you can have great quotes about booze. I mean, that's what author, and drugs, I guess, depending on who you are.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Clearly his favorite drink was a dry martini cocktail. So I looked it up. So he was writing his, The Wasteland came out in 22. So we can say that he was in London, he was in Paris, in the 20s. So I looked up a dry martini cocktail. Now he calls it a dry martini cocktail, which is kind of odd. So I looked it up, and turns out the cocktails, or the martini rather, was a lot different back then than it is now. The recipe I sent you, hopefully you followed it. It's half gin, half vermouth. So it's equal parts of both. Rather than a lot of dry martinis today, is like they basically just coat the glass in vermouth, throw the vermouth out and fill it with gin or vodka or something like that.
Okay.
So this isn't vodka, this is gin. Vodka martinis didn't come around until the 60s. James Bond, we talked about that, really sort of made them famous. So before that, they're all made out of gin. He's in London, makes sense. So half gin, half vermouth. And I found out that it didn't switch to dry vermouth. It actually started out as a sweet drink, kind of a sweet cocktail, and it transformed to a dry vermouth. So that's why you call it a dry martini cocktail. They had a couple of dashes of bitters in it too, which I thought was really weird. So I pre-mixed it. I'm putting it in a glass of ice just to stir it.
I used my shaker, but I poured everything in there just to mix it in there, stirred it, and then because I had the convenient strainer top to it, that's why I used the mixer.
Yeah, I don't have a strainer, so try not to get any ice in there if you can.
Again, it was not easy to find bitters. I ended up at like the third place I went. The grocery store was finally the place where I could get bitters.
So the martini actually had curacao in it. They did away with that, and then they went to orange bitters, and then they just sort of went to bitters. So any type of bitters. Okay. Yeah, and if you notice, it's definitely sort of an orange tint to the drink.
I think you might have put more bitters in. You said just sort of a splash of bitters, so that's really just.
I did a couple of dashes.
That is such a vague amount to me that I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I figured not enough was better than too much.
Yeah, that's a much different drink, but that's really good, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's fine. I like it. I may be a little more bitter, so I could get a little more of that orange taste in it next time.
Yeah,
but
it's a little bit. Well, I don't know how much it's supposed to have. Remember, it evolves. Have you ever had somebody like kind of score a lemon peel and just sort of spritz the lemon peel over your drink? You can actually taste it. I mean, it's that oil in it is so strong. I could spend an after day in London or Paris drinking that. How about you?
Sure, absolutely. Sitting in the backyard, someplace hot, which I would like to be in right now because today it's cold and rainy in New York and horrible. So,
oh well, it's cold and rainy and windy in New Mexico. So
define cold.
Really cold. It's like in the 50s here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, right. It's barely 40. It's actually, I thought it wouldn't be that cold as I went out today because it was about 40. But I got out there and it's because there's no sun and because it's like raining. It was cold enough that my toes were getting cold through my shoes. Like it was, it's a cold day. So we were talking about how Bart said that we should forget about the author and just make our own interpretations of things. And that sort of dovetails with what T.S. Eliot said. I don't have quotes to hand, but there was a lot of talk about how he thought that the poet should strive to have it be as impersonal as possible. To be like, this is just a poem that somebody wrote, and I'm a good poet. I'm not in this poem personally.
Right.
I'm looking at this poem and I'm thinking it through after thinking about that quote, and he did not do that. I don't.
Right.
In fact, my biggest surprise. I have two things I'm thinking about for biggest surprise, both of which I believe are references to T.S. Eliot himself in the poem. So I'll talk about that at the end, but I do not think he managed to be impersonal. I think he shows exactly who he is as a person. I think he shows you, the great assumption is obviously this is a European guy. He's not European in a way, obviously. We can talk about that, which is a weird phenomenon, but this is a white dude living in like 1920, and it's quite obvious. And he's a young person who has just experienced the war as a young person. I think who he is comes across 100% in this poem, even if he was going for something else.
There's a lot of him in the poem. Absolutely.
Oh, totally.
He was rich and he was young. I mean, they called him the original beatniks. Hemingway is in Paris as well, and so is Joyce. He meets Joyce. Ezra Pound was his mentor. So these are all a bunch of beatnik, wealthy, or they come from a wealthy background anyway. Socialites, really, that happen to be really good at their craft, at writing.
They're both in the same time period of modernism, like Hemingway and T.S. Eliot, but they're both having completely different responses to how to do modernism. Or I don't even know, is Hemingway considered modernist or is he a realist author? Is that different? Is that two separate strains? Because I feel like what T.S. Eliot's doing in this poem seems to me a lot like what Picasso is doing in painting.
Yes. Actually,
And
they say that's sort of a visual comparison as a Picasso.
yeah, and I think that's apt. You know, when I think about it, I read it through the first time. And by the way, I thought I had read this, but the only thing I remember at all is the fire sermon. I remember the
Hmm.
opening stanza stuck in my head, and
Hmm.
I remember the concept of the fire sermon because I remember reading the notes and learning about Buddha. And this is a
Hmm.
long time ago. It's like where I learned about some of the basic ideas of Buddhism, like
Hmm.
20 years ago or whatever. So
Hmm.
this was really pretty much me coming to this new
Yeah.
when I read it again this time, and I kind of wasn't expecting that.
I don't think I'd read this since I was like a senior in high school. Coming back
Really.
to it,
But I read
it's a
I read
lot,
it
lot different.
I read it through the first time, and I have to admit I mean, some of the parts, like I said, the opening stanza and several other parts all the way through are just beautiful poetry. They're just great to listen to, even not understanding what he's talking about at all. And then other
Right.
bits, especially like the one that jumped out at me was the part in the bar with the ladies talking to each other,
Hmm.
just sort of like some dialogue. I just
Yeah.
read that and I was like, okay, so you spent months writing this stanza and then what, just rattled this one off in 5 minutes and was like, okay, I'm done. What
Right.
is this? I don't understand this. And there's
Yeah.
several other parts like that. And it's really only I don't think anybody would get this reading it the first time through. I don't think you'd just be like, oh yeah, this is what he's talking about here. Maybe Ezra Pound understood it the first time through if he knew something about who T.S. Eliot was and if he understood every single reference the guy was making, which, I'm pretty well educated, but a lot of this was, some of these are references to things I've read and I didn't even catch them the first time through. Only when other people pointed out, oh, this is a story from Ovid. This is a story
Right.
from, this is Shakespeare. This is,
Hmm.
I get some of the references. Like I was thinking the Canterbury Tales, like when it opens up, I was like, oh, this is a reference to Canterbury Tales. I get that. The first thing in Canterbury Tales is talking about the month of April. So that's not a coincidence, I don't think. But
Hmm.
how about you? So you did this in high school, but otherwise not so much since then?
Oh gosh, no, no, I would never have read this otherwise. Poetry's never been my thing. This brings me back to my literature degree. It really does because it's this very kind
Hmm.
of abstract type of writing.
Not
Let me
just
just say
abstract,
this real quick.
it's difficult.
Yeah, difficult.
Difficult to read. It's not,
So
you're
this
not,
is just for those who haven't read it. The Wasteland is a 434 line poem written in 5 sections. Again, published in 1922. T.S. Eliot was a very sickly kid who grew up very wealthy in St. Louis, studied in various private schools all around the world. He went to Germany right before the World War I broke out and said, I think I'll study somewhere else. And so he left and went to England, studied there. So he was very much at that time a wealthy white kid, globe hopping, white kid with a lot of money and a lot of time on his hands. So what should I do? Oh, I guess I'll be a writer. He gets enters the writing industry as a critic and for a publishing house and so forth, and as a teacher in England. He befriends Ezra Pound, of course, also living in London at the time. Pound becomes kind of a mentor to him. He also meets James Joyce, as we mentioned. So all
Mhm.
these writers, it was a big community, and a lot of these, some people call them the original beatniks, living in London and Paris at the time in the 1920s. But there was a big writing community there. Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald was there. He was Hemingway's buddy that they go around and drink together.
Mhm.
But so it was all kind of like that was the thing to do, I guess. If you had money and were
I
interested in
think I
writing,
mentioned
that's what you would
this.
do.
I think I mentioned this in the Hemingway episode, but what wouldn't I give to go out on the town with Hemingway and Fitzgerald or with James Joyce and Ezra Pound or something? I mean, that's the best night I could possibly imagine hanging out with
Right.
guys like that.
Right.
I saw
I mean,
all I knew
they would
about
go out.
Ezra
You
Pound.
can imagine they would go out all night,
Yeah.
wake, and then sleep till like 2 in the afternoon, get up,
Hmm.
go to the cafe,
Hmm.
have some tiny espressos and a lot of cigarettes and
Hmm.
talk and almost like a salon atmosphere,
Oh
talk
yeah.
about things they've read, paintings they've seen, artists they want to go see, blah, 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 until
Yeah.
the sun goes down. And then they would absolutely do it again. You know,
Yep. Sounds great. I can't think of a better way to spend your like early 20s, late teens. That would be amazing.
when Hemingway was there in Paris, let me look this up real quick. He came up with a cocktail called Slow Death in the Afternoon.
Did he call it that? Because that's the name of one of his
No,
books. That
no, I'm
sounds
sorry.
like,
It's just called Death in the Afternoon.
oh, okay. Well,
Um,
still.
And it does have it shares it with the story, but it is 1.5 ounces of absinthe, 4.5 ounces of chilled champagne. And the
Uh-huh.
way his directions on it are something like pour in slowly so that the absinthe settles, or fills it with a murky glow or some junk. And he's like, drink 5 of these slowly. And I mean, 5 would put you under, man. So
Yeah, I
definitely
bet.
afternoon cocktail. I think he developed that in Paris, obviously with absinthe and champagne.
I just read this book by Robert Kaplan that's about the Adriatic Sea, and for some reason, I don't know if he just randomly took Ezra Pound's cantos with him, but he
Mhm.
talked about Ezra Pound constantly. And then after, while I'm like mostly done with that book, you suggested this, and so I was thinking, oh, that's weird. Like for some reason, Ezra Pound is coming up a lot in my life recently. All I knew about the guy was that he was kind of a mediocre poet. Like I don't think he was considered that at the time. He was considered great, but the problem is he became a Nazi
Right.
later. So everybody went back and
Yeah.
reevaluated his poetry and said that it sucked, which I don't know if that's true or not, but I could see why they would feel that way. I was looking people up in the course of researching this, and I saw these pictures, and I was like, Ezra Pound was cool looking, like as a young
Yeah.
guy. He
Yeah.
had like he like a really that's the guy I would want to look like back in those days. But
Well, I think all of the again, if you had money, you had no worries in the world, you could just be a cool beatnik guy. I
yeah,
mean
exactly.
the beatniks that came later, the real beatniks, Kerouacs and Cassidy's and stuff. We talked about this. The difference between them and Burroughs is Burroughs had money. None of them did, right? So they're always scripting and
Hmm.
scraping. That was always part of their mystique. These guys had money. They would hang
Hmm.
out, and they would spend it lavishly. I mean, none of them were broke. Hemingway talks about having to rent a cheap flat or whatever in Paris, but Hemingway is a trust fund baby. Most of them all were. So that's just
Yeah,
sort
I
of what you
guess
did. They all looked sharp. They all had this look about them. Yeah, they're good looking people.
they're good looking in the way guys in bands are a lot of the time. They're just cool looking. I read this book about the music scene in New York in the late 90s, and they kept talking about how good looking the guys in the Strokes were. And so I was looking at the pictures, I was like, they're cool looking. They're not
Yes.
good looking. They're
Right.
cool looking. It's not the
Yeah.
same thing. It's the
Yeah.
kind of looks that appeal to guys and girls. You know,
Yeah.
if you have like NSYNC, women think they're attractive, or sorry, gay men and women think they're attractive. Straight guys are not like, oh yeah, I want to look like those guys, you know. Whereas like
Right.
when I saw Ezra Pound, I'm like, that guy's cool. I would want to dress like that guy and emulate
Yeah.
him if he's younger, you know. It's a
Yeah.
different kind of aesthetic appeal. What's your
My
favorite? What's
privilege
your
privilege definitely leaks out of their appearance, I think.
Oh, I mean, and just
For
the
sure.
education, just to have this level
Yeah.
of
Yeah. For sure.
education in you
Yeah.
is a privilege, right? And he's
Yes. Of
from,
course.
of all the places in the world to be from, St. Louis.
Right.
So
St.
we
Louis.
are we
Yeah.
are doing a series here on Toasting the Classics on the great poets of the Upper Midwest. So we did Kanye West from
Yeah.
Chicago,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
now we've got
This is the first and last volume of that one right there.
yeah,
That's right.
exactly. I don't know how many
Yeah.
more. Maybe Mark Twain. Mark Twain is a great
Okay,
author
Twain,
from the
perhaps. Yeah.
Midwest, but I
Twain.
associate
Yeah.
him with the South. Despite him also being from Missouri, he feels more Southern.
Yeah.
Although apparently T.S. Eliot was
Right.
kind of self-conscious about his Southern accent. I think he did have one.
He escaped and he never really came back. I mean,
No,
he
he never even went back to Harvard to finish his PhD.
no.
He wrote a
He was
philosophy PhD there and he just gave up
yeah.
on it, never went home.
Yeah.
There's a thing on Spotify that you can listen to that's him reading the Wasteland,
Mhm.
and he has a British accent. It's obviously an affectation. Like I listened to one by Alec Guinness, that's probably
Mhm.
my favorite. But there's another one with Alfred from Batman,
Mhm.
Michael Gow did
Mhm.
one that on YouTube that you could watch. Jeremy Irons did one. There's a whole bunch of really great British voices doing the Wasteland. I
Mhm.
think I think Obi-Wan Kenobi is probably my favorite, but I could be.
Yeah, I can see that.
I don't know.
I don't know who I heard. It was good though. I listened to it as well, which is something I would recommend to anybody listening. Definitely read it. Read it yourself, but then have somebody trained
Yeah.
go listen to them read it. And they've got all the right pauses and they've been trained on sort of how to read this I have to train
Hmm.
to read a poem, but when he wrote this, you can see the staggered lines.
Hmm.
They have meaning to them, and it represents how you're supposed to intone this particular line, and where you stutter and where you stop and where you pause, and so it's all sort of partly there, and people, get trained on how to read these things. So definitely read it yourself, but also, and I'll say it doesn't take long to read. It's an hour, something like that, maybe an hour, maybe 45 minutes. It's
No,
just
no,
not long at
the
all.
ones when the pros are reading it on Spotify and YouTube and things like that, it's 26, 27 minutes that they're
Mm,
taking to read through. So it's not a
yeah.
long time.
Now,
But if you
if you
read
take the
it
time to actually look up like
exactly.
a
Yeah.
line in German, what does this
And
mean? If you take the time, then
looking up the
it doesn't
lines
take
in
long.
German, I think so. A lot of the references, so like there's the Frisch der Wind, in Zu Heimat, whatever that one that's in the
Uh-huh.
beginning.
Yeah.
So that's like, on one hand, what I read it for is it's just supposed to be sort of a confused babble of voices, which is
Hmm.
definitely part of the theme of the poem. So you could read it with that and not look it up. But
Hmm.
they're also, each one of those quotes from another language is a reference to something in particular,
Hmm.
and will be enriched by reading what it is. I mean,
Yeah.
that's from Wagner. That's Tristan and Isolde. There's two
Hmm.
references to that in the first section.
Hmm.
There's the burial. There's five sections. That's another thing. I don't know. We mentioned that, but they sort of represent almost completely different chapters and
Hmm.
different voices of the poem. There's the burial shroud, a game of chess, the fire sermon, death by water, which is really short, and then what the thunder said. And
Hmm.
some of it it's just going to go right over your head if you don't look things up. I think.
Right.
Again, I think I said this before, but I just can't imagine somebody reading this and being able to understand all the references. It's
Right.
very much like James Joyce. I used to date a girl in college. She was a poet. She was studying English literature, and she was currently a poet. And I remember her because it was before the internet. You couldn't just look everything up easily, every single
Hmm.
reference to James Joyce. So she was literally pointing things out in Ulysses and asking me, "Well, what's this a reference to?" And I'd be like, "I can help you with 20% that you wouldn't get from somebody else, maybe, but there's some
Yeah.
classical stuff that I recognize." But it's kind of fun almost. It's almost like that's the
Yeah.
project, is to sit and maybe in the way that we have the internet, so we could have something completely filled with illusions. Maybe in that time, just because of the ubiquity of print and how much people could read and stuff, maybe it was kind of fun to have a million references to things. I don't know. Maybe that's part of the phenomenon of
There's a part of me that thinks that so snobs like it because they can appreciate it. I mean, the
uh-huh.
highest of the highbrow. So it's kind of like maybe it's a challenge. Like you'll only get all this stuff if you're really smart. Okay. And you've read all
Right.
this stuff too. And so the snobs read it.
Hmm.
And truly, those people that know all those references get it. But this was like a critical and financial success. I mean, this was his opus. It really was his opus, and it was critical. All of well, not all the critics, but it was a slow burn for a bit, but it was certainly a financial success for him. Won all these awards, everything else, but it really made him, set him in stone. Now, of all the people that could read this and get it, I would say that would be 2% of probably anybody that actually read it and bought it. I think there's a huge part out there of people that want to look smart and, oh,
Hmm.
Ezra Pound says this is the best thing in the world. So I have to read it too. I don't know what the hell it says,
Right.
but Ezra Pound says it's really smart. And I want to look like I'm smart. So I'm going to read it too. Right. It's kind of
You know what
like,
that reminds me? It reminds me
uh,
of the way people treated Einstein at the same time. It was like somebody had a quote that said, general relativity, this is 1915 that comes out. So there's probably 50 people in the entire world that
if that,
know
yeah,
what
if
this
that.
means, right?
Right.
Yet
Yeah.
Einstein was treated as this public intellectual and beloved by everybody,
Mm.
and referred to as being, this is the example of the smartest person in the world.
Right.
And
Right.
it's very similar because like I think this is a little more accessible than the work of Einstein, honestly. Like
Hmm.
maybe that's
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
tend towards the humanities rather than the maths and science,
Sure.
but I think it's similar. I mean, I think this is pretty inscrutable to the average person. Especially if
Yeah.
I didn't
So
have
it's
the
like,
internet, if I didn't have the internet to look up this stuff,
right. But
no
it's like,
way.
a lot of it's like, it's reputation built on recommendation. It's not something, I don't think most people would go out and find this thing and read it, even at the time. They're reading it because all of these really smart, famous people read it and recommended it and said it's really smart. And so I want to be smart or I want people to think I'm smart. I think there's a big part of that. That exists today. I mean,
Oh, it's
how many
worse
people
today.
really like David Lynch's movies?
Yeah.
Especially his very, very early work. But everybody loves David Lynch. Oh God, he's a genius, blah, blah, blah. It
He
comes down
found
to, and I
I
used to
think
say that about Radiohead, you know, Um,
Okay, but
like
yeah, but
how many people really listen to Radiohead? How many people really listen to OK
right,
Computer and appreciated it and
right.
understand it and blah 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 versus those people who just want to seem smart and they know that that's everybody thinks that that's smart, so that's what they listen to. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
I think on this podcast a few times before I've bashed Jean-Michel Basquiat,
uh-huh.
um, because I
All right.
think I just may be, and I think poetry for me, I was going to say this before, poetry and modern art are very similar to me. They're
Mhm.
things that I have tried over and over again to come back to and really get into. And I
Yeah.
appreciate poetry a lot more than I appreciate most modern art. Once you get to
Mhm.
things that are, like I said, like Basquiat, once you get to that, I'm looking at it and I'm just thinking like, who, and this, at least I can read this and I can read what smart people have to say about it and I can hear them. I'm like, I
Mhm.
agree with you. You're right. You're
Yeah.
saying
Yeah.
smart things about this poem and you're right. For the most part in the art world, I think what happens is it's just a question of personality. You get somebody who's
Yeah.
cooler than you telling you you're stupid if you don't understand this painting. They're not particularly bright. They can't really explain to you what's so great about the
Sure.
painting.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
you're sort of lost with like, oh, you just don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
My my wife got in an argument with somebody online. She was critiquing some trend in shoes, and some woman,
Uh-huh.
for just
Oh,
she was like,
jeez.
people are just stupid for buying these things. They just buy whatever anybody tells them to. And some lady was like, well, that's okay. Not everybody understands fashion. And
Oh, geez.
I was like, yeah, see, that's the kind of argument I would expect. If I was like, I don't like this painting, I don't understand this painting, somebody be like, well,
Yeah.
that's just because you don't get it and you're stupid. End of
Right.
story.
Explain to me why I can't take a paintbrush, do that with it, and make a Jackson Pollock. Okay.
The answer, and I said this actually to my wife the other day. We were at the Whitney and we were looking at something, and she was like, she said that. It's like my first inclination is always like, I could do this. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
okay, that's true. But what the response to that, which is correct, is, but you didn't.
Right.
You
No,
you
absolutely.
could have
That's
done
that's
this,
true.
but you didn't. This person
Well,
thought of doing
yeah.
it. Jackson Pollock did something nobody'd ever done before. Going back
Yep.
to the 30s with Jackson Pollock, I get things still. As it gets a little
Yeah.
farther forward, they start to lose me. But
Yep.
if somebody said to me, The Wasteland is just all about reputation and it's not really good, even I could sit down and tell them what's great about this poem. This is a great,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm kind of giving away my
We
vote here, but I'm just saying this is a great poem. Like it
well,
really
I'll
is.
tell you, I'll say this, a lot of it is really if if it gives you a feeling. I mean, if you look at something and you just have no feeling about it at all,
Mhm.
you're completely lukewarm, it's milk toast, and then I would say that whatever it is probably complete reputation. It's great that it's beloved by geniuses, but if anybody else looks at it and they don't get something out of it, and I think that's where the analogy that this is all built on reputation sort of falls apart because you can read this and you'll get a feeling from it. You'll feel, especially when you tie it with the title, right? You anchor that title with it, The Wasteland. As a Gen X, I can read this and see Nirvana in it. I really can. It sounds weird.
I said
I can.
exactly that. I was talking about how when you listen to the lyrics of one of the better Nirvana songs,
Uh-huh.
at first they sort of sound like nonsense, and then you mull them over a little bit, and you can kind of understand the connections that are being made. They're loose connections that can give you an impression of the feeling of something that he's trying to say. And it's not
Right.
on this level, obviously. I don't mean to really compare the
No.
two things, but I did actually mention that those kind of lyrics, wow, I don't know if I could explain to you what they mean. And sometimes I wonder whether he even intended them to have the meaning that I'm taking from them. You can hear like a connection between the words that he's using and the title of a song and an impression that they give. But I
Yeah.
don't know if that was his intention or whether it's just me coming up with that. But I think that's
Yeah.
I think sometimes I've always wondered this about art, especially literature, because we find
Mhm.
all these allusions and references and themes and things in great literature. And I always wonder
Mhm.
whether it's like when I have a dream, I experience the dream, I wake up and I remember it. And if I think about it, I can usually figure out the symbolism that was in the dream and stuff. And I think
Mhm.
my brain generated that like subconsciously. It just generated the dream. I didn't intend
Right.
to create a story that's a dream, and yet it's filled with metaphor and meaning in my life. And sometimes I think that's what art is like. I think sometimes you write a poem or you write the lyrics to a song, and you had no intention to put forth the themes that come out of it, and yet there they are, and they really do work. So I always wonder that about artists. Myself not being an artist, I really don't know, but this seems intentional. I think this was crafted. I think the
Well,
Wasteland.
it was most, yeah. Well, I think they're all crafted though. It's trying to express how you feel about something at a deeper level than just saying commercialism sucks and we're all getting ripped off by the government and
Yeah.
down with the man. I mean, that's what they did in the 60s. It was fairly obvious, but you can have a deeper meaning by expressing more of a feeling. Like what it seems to me like he's doing, it almost seems because there are different conversations happening in
Hmm.
this poem and different voices and different characters that are talking. I mean, this is some of the stuff I get out of it. So they're all disconnected. And to me, that's sort of a statement on kind of life at that time. We're all pursuing our own things. Some people are poor and broke and in a pub talking about stuff that poor people talk about, and some people are talking about really highbrow stuff. These different conversations going on, none of them really connected. There's also, I mean, just the name, the Wasteland, and kind of how it anchors to everything. There's a few different ways to think about that. Like he was in Europe post World War One, and World War One. I
Hmm.
mean, that was, you could describe, the battlefields of France and Germany as that, right? This is
Oh
the
yeah.
wasteland, or maybe it's the generation that was involved in that. It could be, if you think about it, it could be a statement about, like, in America, we're entering the Roaring Twenties. None of that affected us. We got rich off of World War One, and we were doing
Yeah.
great, right? It was Europe who had to pretty much shoulder the economic and physical burden of war, right? And we did that never affected us, so we're having a great
No.
time.
No, not the
And
same way.
so
No.
there's this, just like there's these disconnected voices of kind of highbrow versus lowbrow.
I'm going to ruin one of my greatest surprises here because I think
Okay,
it's really apropos of what you're saying because
okay,
the difference between Europe and America at the time and how
yeah,
this is the onset of just a complete collapse of Europeans' confidence in their civilization. And that's what he's
right,
writing about, right? He's writing
yeah,
about that to
yeah,
me. That's what this poem is
yeah,
about. It's about what's left after the war, after that confidence has been destroyed.
yeah,
And the difference as Americans, our 20th century was so different, right,
yeah,
from the European experience because we didn't even World War II, which was horrible, was like a
yeah,
triumphant time for Americans. It was like
yes,
the greatest moment of American civilization is those 30 years after World War II or the 20 years afterwards.
yes,
And it's I think in some ways a lot of the vitality that remained in Europe, especially in the United Kingdom, there was still quite a bit of cultural vitality and stuff like that. A lot of it was inspired by the United States and the fact that we had not suffered as much in the world wars.
yes.
And really interesting thing that he talks about in the last part, what the thunder said, where the
Hmm.
guy, there's the description of the wasteland and the red rock and the lack of water, and not even the
Hmm.
hermit thrush singing, right?
Hmm.
Specifically the bird, the hermit thrush. And I looked it
Yeah,
up. The hermit thrush is an American bird. It does not live in Europe. And not
yeah,
only does it not live in Europe and is American, Walt Whitman used the hermit thrush as a symbol for the
mm,
American voice in culture and in literature. And so I was thinking that's like a reference to, in some way, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's not intentional, but it seems to me like a reference to like the American like voice in the wilderness, like being the thing that sort of props up Europe to some extent, like a little
yeah.
bit of like optimism and hope of like a new spring and stuff like that. I
Hmm.
don't know.
Hmm.
Maybe that's my overwrought theory of the week, but I thought that was really cool. Like that really, I read that and I was thinking because he is American, he sort of
Yeah,
abandoned being American, but he is
hmm,
American. And I
yeah.
think he really suffered the First World War the way that Europeans did. I think he saw himself as a European, and
He became English. He changed his citizenship, but
he strikes me as a
yeah,
man that definitely looked down on all things American. But then he made that
yeah,
reference, and I think that's a deliberate
yeah.
reference. I don't think that's an accident.
I think it was, you're right. It was completely crafted. But the sound of water over a rock where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip
Hmm.
drip drop drop. But there is no water. Yeah, it is an amazing poem. I just love that opening line. That's probably his most famous line is April is the cruelest of months, or the cruelest
Hmm.
month.
Yeah, yeah, I love
Breeding
that.
lilacs. What was it? Breeding lilacs out of the dead land.
Out of the Deadland. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's
no,
such it's so contrary to what we all think that we call dead of winter, The winter is the dead time, and he calls winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers.
I
Uh,
didn't. So it opens with
so
that
interesting. Hmm.
that portion of the poem, the burial shroud, opens with that, right? It opens with the April is the cruelest month and the winter kept us warm. And I was, the first
Hmm.
time I read it, I was thinking, oh, it's like obviously a juxtaposition. There's supposed to be some irony there.
Hmm.
And then there's the reference to Canterbury Tales. I don't know exactly what he means by that, but just it's just references to lots of things from deep European culture, in other words, I guess.
Yeah,
But
yeah, maybe.
he says winter kept us warm, and I was thinking, what would that mean? I was thinking that could be a reference to the dead. The dead are
Mm.
underground, buried,
Mm.
and
Oh,
the
interesting.
winter insulates you with snow and keeps
Mm.
you warm if
Mm.
you're underground. And then the end of the section, the burial shroud, he meets somebody on the street and he says to him, "Did that corpse that you planted in your garden bloom? Make sure the dog doesn't come and like dig up that corpse from your yard." And I was thinking that kind of brings it around, right? It's like the two things. Oh, and then there's another Walt Whitman reference. When lilacs last and the dooryard bloomed,
Right. Yeah, it's
when
true.
Lincoln died. Oh, the lilacs. I didn't think of that. But anyway, so
Hmm.
I mean, it brings it around. And I think it's talking about burial. I read one that was really cool. This guy was talking about how April is the cruelest month because if you've been through so much death and suffering, like in World War One,
Hmm.
that even the sight of new flowers in the spring just makes you think, oh, that's going to be destroyed too. Look at that new life.
Hmm.
That new life is going to be destroyed, just like the next generation of people will be killed by the next war because war is a bit of. And I was thinking, well, I like that too. That's a pretty good interpretation on it too.
Hmm.
I don't know what he
Interesting.
meant by it. I really, really like how, and I didn't come up with this myself. I don't want to claim it, but the opening bit, actually before the first line of the poem, the
Hmm.
quote from trying to remember what it's. Oh no, I know exactly what it's from the Satyricon. There's the quote from the Satyricon up top that's about the
Hmm. Right.
it's in Greek and Latin, and
Yeah.
somebody pointed out that that work is only known in fragments. So he opens up this
Hmm.
poem that's going to be all about fragments of civilization left over after the end of civilization, with a fragment of something left from a civilization that was destroyed. I thought that was super cool. I thought that was a really cool touch. It's like putting a little Roman ruin at the beginning of the thing,
Yeah,
talking about
that's
how
really
all of our
interesting.
cities are ruined. And I
Mhm.
don't know, there's a lot of cool stuff like that in here. I mean, really, you could talk about it.
So this is actually, it's interesting to think about. So it's 400, what I say, 24 or 34 lines. It's very brief. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
very long at all.
It's
I
fairly
mean,
long for a poem, I think,
it's long for a poem, right? But
but it not,
it's
but there's like, it's not like the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner that
well,
goes
or
on
the
and
Epic
on.
of Gilgamesh. It's not,
No, it's not like
or
that.
the Iliad or any of
Or
those.
the
But I
Iliad or
mean,
the Odyssey or
um,
the Aeneid
yeah,
or Ovid,
yeah, Dante's.
Yeah,
What was I going
I
to say?
read a quote from Ezra Pound where he said it's the longest poem in
Oh,
the
that's
English
what I was
language.
saying.
And I was thinking about it. I was like, no, it's you knew better than that. What do you do? Paradise Lost is like a book. What are you talking
Yeah.
about?
Yeah. Paradise Lost is
There's
much
lots.
longer. That's what I was going to say was we're getting the abridged version. So Ezra
Right.
Pound went through this like 3 or 4 times as long.
Yeah.
And Ezra Pound went through it and just wholesale cut stuff out, left it on the editing floor, as they say. I'm sure somewhere you could find the unabridged version. I wonder how different it is.
Oh, I don't know whether he kept this. I think so. I think like the longer version of portion part four, the death by
Mhm.
water section was apparently much longer. There's a whole section about a whole character that he followed for like
Yeah.
70 lines that got cut out.
Well, he had a much longer prologue. He had a much longer epilogue. So I mean, there's a lot that was taken out. They had yeah, that's interesting to think about.
Right.
Um,
What does that say about what his intentions were? And I don't know. There's a whole lot of actually I saw a whole I think it was in the annotated book that I have, but there was a whole discussion about somebody went and analyzed because they're trying to figure out in what order did he work on the
yeah.
various parts of the
Hmm.
poem. And
Yeah.
somebody went back and found the old manuscripts and analyzed which typewriter he had been using so that they could figure out he actually worked on part three before he worked on parts one and two. And I was thinking, oh man, the just the exhaustive
Wow.
level of detail.
Yeah.
I'm glad somebody's
Yeah.
doing it, but like
Right.
my God, I'm glad that's not
That
my
person
job.
that person is an assistant professor, makes $30,000 a year. So
Yes, exactly.
think about
It's
that the next time.
he
But I
said
mean,
I think I can't remember if it's at the end of the poem or the beginning, but
yeah,
he where he dedicates it to Ezra Pound. It's at the
yeah,
beginning. He calls him
yeah,
Il Miglior Fabbro. He calls
yeah.
him the better craftsman. And I was
Well,
like,
I was just wondering that, like, how much credit do we give? We give Eliot all the credit, but Pound,
obviously Ezra Pound is a big, because Ezra Pound
yeah,
not only sort of brought this work to publication and edited it, but he did the same thing for Ulysses.
yes,
Basically, it's
yeah, he
two
did.
of the greatest works of 20th century literature. Ezra Pound is critical to both of those things. And
Right,
Ezra Pound is the
right,
common link between those two things.
yeah, for sure.
So you got to give him some amount of credit. But I kind of think that little epitaph to him, I don't know if it's an epitaph, it's the right word, but whatever, that little comment towards him, I think is a little bit
Mhm.
backhanded if you think about it. Because I think
Yeah,
he's saying, like, yeah, you're the better craftsman. You're better at like putting together a poem and editing and stuff. But like I wrote this. Like this, I'm the
yeah,
one who has the inspiration. You're just a
maybe,
craftsman.
yeah,
You know,
maybe.
you're
Oh,
like
Craftsman. Oh,
you're like
oh,
a
that's the
you're like you're like a carpenter, or the guy that
oh,
lays down the
there's that's
tile.
the
But
well, I mean, there's Plato has a whole discussion about art versus techne, and
It's funny you
we're
mentioned Plato too, because Ezra
yeah,
Pound called himself the midwife of this poem, and that's what
yes, right,
I think Socrates used to call himself, the midwife, like
right.
make other people give birth to great ideas.
We're getting towards
I
the
think
time. So what are you thinking?
well, let me
Well,
give
first of all, you're
you my
surprised.
let
Yeah,
me give you. Well,
first of all, you're
did
surprised.
anything surprise you on the reread?
I was surprised at how much Eastern philosophy there was in here.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I'm
Buddhism.
sorry we didn't get a chance
Um,
to talk about it because some of it's really cool, actually.
yeah, he apparently learned Sanskrit, and he read a lot of very very old ancient. Maybe that was a thing to do. I don't know.
It
I don't
was.
see a lot of
It
I
just
don't see a lot of others that went to that extent. But
No, there's a lot of, I was thinking about, I made a note about to talk about it a little bit, but I think because of the British Empire, there was this huge
mm,
influence of India on a lot of
yeah.
works in the early
Oh,
20th
interesting.
century. You had lots of people referring,
Mm,
and then I was thinking, well, that changed. Why did that change? And I don't know if I haven't followed this up in any way, but it just occurred to me today. I was like, one of the most famous appropriations of Indian culture in Western civilization
hmm
is the
hmm
swastika. And I
Oh,
was
that's true.
thinking
Yeah,
that might have led to the end of that at some point. It might have been those, because that
maybe.
belief in the Aryans, and a lot of these guys ended up being Nazis too. So I don't know,
Yes.
maybe that had a bad, and obviously the Hindus have nothing to do with Nazism. They're not responsible for it in any way.
Right.
But the fact that the
It
same
means
people,
peace and love. It means peace and love. Damn it.
yeah, exactly. Well, it's kind of like Wagner. I was listening to Wagner
Yeah.
while I was reading this because of the Wagner references, and I was like, he's amazing. Nobody ever talks
Yes.
about Wagner anymore.
They
Wagner's work
can't.
is spectacular, but
They
it's
can't.
just associated with Nazism completely unfairly. But yeah, so yeah, the Eastern stuff surprised you. I like the bit about what the thunder said. That's probably my favorite part of the
Yeah.
what's your favorite part of the
Yeah.
poem?
Favorite part of the poem is probably the very first section. I don't know why.
The opening, yeah.
Um, but then again, I think I'm 1 degree off from being goth. So
Yeah.
for some
Yeah.
reason, that one sort of appeals to me. It just sort of sets the atmosphere for the rest of it. So we have all this imagery in the first one that creates the wasteland for you, and the rest of it, because there are parts in the rest of it that shy away from all of that, but that you've already got April's the cruelest month
Mhm.
ingrained. You've got corpses. You've got all
Yeah.
this stuff right at the beginning that sort of colors your how you read the rest of it, and sort of what everything represents after that. So yeah,
Did
I
you
like that first one. I like the setting the stage.
I never noticed this. I have been to British pubs, but do they say hurry up, please, it's time
No,
when it's closing time? Is that a thing? I mean, that's
no.
everywhere I read, they're like, that's the traditional call at the end of the night at a British pub. And I was like, I never heard
I guess
anybody.
I'll have to. I'm going this summer,
Maybe
so I'll have to.
there you
So
go.
I'll have to
Maybe
let you
maybe it
know.
used to
Yeah,
be. Maybe it still would be in a small town. Maybe it's more
it's
of
a
a
research
like
trip, by the way. So this will be part of the research.
there
I'll
you
have to go to
go.
a
There you
pub.
go. Yeah,
I'll have to
that's
close down a pub and see what they say.
yeah, you have to. You're just gonna have to. So
So,
my biggest surprise is actually a piece of research done by, how sometimes they have amateur astronomers
mhm.
find new stars and things like that. An amateur guy went and analyzed the poem and he came up with this. And I actually Googled it because I was curious about it. I was thinking, who's Stetson? When he's on the bridge and he hails the guy and he
Mm,
says, "Hey, Stetson." And
mhm,
then says later his name is Ariel. I was like, what's that a reference to? And there's a lot of stuff, but
mhm.
this amateur guy figured out that Thomas Stearns Eliot can anagram to Ariel something Stetson. So it's just a
Interesting.
reference to T.S. Eliot. It's an anagram of his
That's
name.
interesting.
And T.S. Eliot is well recorded as being a fan of things like anagrams. So it's pretty
So,
clear that
you're saying that Jim Morrison with Mr. Mojo Rising was taking a page from T.S. Eliot?
Oh, that's the first I've ever heard of that, but that does make
You've
sense.
never, you didn't know that? That
No, I'm
Mr.
not a
Mojo
Doors
Rising
guy.
was
I'm not a Doors guy, but that's cool. I like that. But yeah, probably I
Mr.
could see Jim Morrison being
Mojo
influenced.
Rising.
I could
Probably
see him I could see him being influenced by T.S.
T.S.
Eliot,
Eliot.
sure.
Certainly by the Eastern philosophy. It is so easy to dismiss poetry, like modernist or abstract art of any kind, because of where the progression went, right? When you
Uh-huh.
tape a banana to a wall and call that art, because that has happened and is
Yes,
out
I'm
there.
sure it is. Yeah.
Have you heard this story? You got to go look it up.
No, no,
The
I
best
haven't.
part of the story is the guy that walked up, took the banana off the wall, and ate it. The artist
Yeah.
was pissed. Anyway,
Oh, was the
but
artist? I would have thought that would have been part of it. I would have thought that the artist was.
no, he was
Oh,
ticked. It
okay.
was like that's like $30,000. It was a banana. Anyway,
Oh,
so I think what the conclusion, it's sort of the conclusion of any reductionist type of theory or philosophy, or even relativist theory or philosophy. You get to a point where it's all relative. It's nothing. It's just nothing. Bleh. Okay, there
mhm.
you go. Is murder okay? Oh well, it's all relative. No,
Right.
it shouldn't be. I think what happened with modernist poetry is the conclusion that it kind of came to, where you have one word on a page or something like that. There's the very people wanting to be very abstract about it. But that aside, what I'm saying, I guess, is that I never really appreciated it because I was very jaded by that. I came back to
Mhm.
it, coming back to it now here, it's a lot more meaningful. And again, like you and I both got Nirvana out of it. We're looking at
Yeah,
like
it's
like
funny.
the
Yeah.
angsty type of stuff, poetry of our generation, and looking at this and saying, oh, this is sort of the origin of that. I don't know. It's I appreciated it quite a bit. So
I wish I talked about this a little more while we were going through the poem, but I feel like I actually thought I'm getting the sense from talking to you about the poem that this is not what you
mhm.
were thinking in choosing it. But I felt like this is a very appropriate poem for today. For I
I
don't know
told you
how
that.
other
No,
people.
I,
Okay,
I
all
even
right,
told you
okay.
that. Go back to
Yeah,
the tape.
but
Go back to our
but I
tape
feel
from last
like
time.
I feel like, but well, okay, yeah, no, you did say something along those lines, but I feel like I don't know if other people feel this way about America in 2024,
Mhm,
but I feel like all of the things I thought were great about our culture and our
mhm,
civilization are like
mhm.
in ruin
Yes.
and like need some kind of rejuvenation, like some kind of a let's let's change this and like and let's get some of these young people to like do something instead of complaining about
Right.
everything. Do what
Yeah.
you do best, like innovate. Find me something
Yeah.
new that makes me fall in love with this culture all over again. I don't know. That's kind of what I was taking out of it. I was reading and I was like, that's why this is having so much meaning for me at the time because I feel like,
Mm.
and then I was thinking, is that just how everybody feels when they get older? Because, was
There's certainly a glory days kind of aspect to it, but it's also like, I don't know, it's something about like you're finding deeper meaning in things that you didn't pay attention to when you were younger. And I guess, kudos to T.S. Eliot. He was only like 23 or something like that when he wrote this.
uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
quite young. Of course, Kurt Cobain was about 23 when he broke through, died at
Yep. Yep.
27. But
So was Jim Morrison.
yeah, so yeah, the 27 Club. It struck me differently because of the time we're living in. If you were
Hmm.
living in like the 1950s with the Mad Men era where America was the giant on earth or something like that, maybe it would have
Right.
would have spoken differently. But again, remember he wasn't writing in America, he was writing in Europe. And from
Right.
that perspective, they were a wasteland in a lot of different ways.
I would think for Americans it'd be the 70s would be. I always think that what we're doing right now is very similar to what the 70s were like. Like there was all this turmoil and everybody was just kind of, and yet when
Yeah.
you look back at the 70s, there's a ton of cultural just wealth going on. There's a million great movies, the music is cool. Like
Yeah.
when I
Yeah,
looked
but
back on it when I was a kid and I thought about the 70s, I was like, oh, that was the terrible time. That was the
yeah,
dark time,
I remember that.
Then
I
you
did
look
too. Yeah,
when you look back
yeah,
on it now, you're like, oh, there's all this wonderful stuff that came out of that
right.
decade. And I'm like,
But the
that is
70s,
not going to happen for the
they didn't try
2020s.
to conceptually change what we are. Like there was always
No,
some
it's quite
founding.
I think it's
founding.
quite the opposite. I think the great stuff from the 70s is all a callback to something earlier.
Oh, exactly. Trying to go back. Yeah,
It's
trying to go
all
back.
it's all like it's all
Right.
like well not necessarily trying to go back, but like what
No,
this
no, no.
poem
I don't
is.
mean like I
Like
don't mean like going back old fashioned, but trying to remember.
remembering.
It's like remember why you're here. Remember
Yeah.
why you're here. Remember what we were founded on, type of thing. That was the 70s. You're right. Late
Yeah.
60s and 70s were like that. But now, okay. So like for example, freedom of speech. I mean, they had rallies for freedom of speech on Berkeley. At Berkeley and at various campuses all over the world because they were getting pushback for speaking out against the war, okay, against Vietnam. Now you have rallies in defense of censorship. Like you can't say, people shouldn't be able to say what they want.
What I've realized is that I've always been a big free speech advocate, like free speech, end of story.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's free speech. But what I've realized is that most people, they advocate free speech for what they want to say.
Exactly.
And when somebody says something and disagree with them, all of a sudden they don't believe in free speech anymore.
Right. I think we have sprinted out of bounds from
we're definitely
subject.
not talking about what we were meant to talk about.
This is the part that everybody in America is waiting for, Dave. It's
That's
all
right.
on you right now.
And I have telegraphed.
Are you going to
myself-
toast this classic?
I have telegraphed myself throughout this work. I think this is great.
Yeah.
I had a blast reading this and learning about it and following up illusions and things. I don't know. I think maybe you actually don't like this as much as I do, but this is my jam. Like the erudite douchebag that is supposed to like this poem, that is this is me. Maybe not quite the guy he envisioned, but I'm just saying I enjoy looking up references to things, and I really dug this. So I'm all in.
It's funny you say that. Maybe I didn't enjoy it as much as you. Well, first of all, I'm glad to hear it. I'm going to let you edit in clinking sound. So cheers, clink. Okay. It's not that I don't enjoy it. It's just that I spend more time in this world than you do. This is where I work.
Yeah.
You got to know that.
Probably a little more cynical. You're a little more cynical about literature than I am. Yeah, it's probably true.
I'm not so much cynical. It's a little bit more pedestrian to me than it is to you. It's a bit more novel to do this sort of work.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this is sort of where I live. But anyway, well, I'm glad to hear it. I really am. This is sort of just one of those things where I looked and I'm like, what can we do? And I was like, oh man, we haven't read a really long poem. I didn't want to get a Paradise Lost, but this is something
I have a perspective list of topics to do on the show, and on there it was literally written long poems. Wasteland ? So
well, look at that. See,
I had the idea of doing
Gary, that we're starting to meld, doing a Vulcan mind meld right here. All right.
So I'm toasting. So this has passed the Toasting the Classics gauntlet. The Wasteland survives. It is not.
Do you have our recommendation, everybody? You need to go out and read this poem, or have somebody read it to you.
Read it once. Give yourself a chance. Yeah. Try to read it once. Then listen to it. And then if you're digging it at all, if you enjoy the couple of passages that are just great poetry, go ahead and hit the illusions and have some fun with the references, because they enrich what the poem means. You cannot say something too smart about this poem, I think. You cannot out intellectualize T.S. Eliot. Go for it. Like I said, my overwrought theory of the week about the hermit thrush, just do things like that and you'll be rewarded. Anyway.
Also just take time to absorb just how it makes you feel. I mean, that's a big part of this.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of modernist art is don't worry about the words. Don't worry about what you're seeing, in a Picasso painting. Like, how does it make you feel? Because that's what they're going for. And I think that's a big part of it is experiential type of thing. So thank you for joining us, all 5 of you. We really appreciate it.
Yep. Everyone. My name's Dave McArthur.
My name is Dr. Professor PhD Clint Lanier, PhD.
I didn't know you had 2 PhDs. That's good.
I just repeated it front and back. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us again, and we will see you next time on
Toasting the Classics. Peace out, everybody.
There you go. Peace out.
That's it for episode 93 of Toasting the Classics. For those playing along at home, stay tuned to find out what we'll be drinking as we talk about the much heralded Western film Once Upon a Time in the West. If you'd like to get in touch, please send us an email at toastingtheclassics@gmail.com. Send us show ideas, comments, complaints, and any thorny lyrical passages thick with illusion you may have crafted. Check out my blog at theattractivenuisance.com and follow us on Twitter at @attractivenuisance. Our music was written by Michelle McArthur. See you next time on Toasting the Classics.